Hello, my name is Tolg, and I exist, therefore I think too much. I'm going to read The Metamorphosis by Kafka, and maybe at the end give an understanding of my takeaway. I left off where the cook pleaded to leave the house and swore that she would never speak on anything happening. And where the family was getting together daily to, in hushed tones, discuss what was happening with Gregor, who has turned into a bug. So it's just a read through, and then my opinions, maybe. Yep. So, starts off, now Gregor's sister had to cook too, helping her mother, true. The cooking did not amount to much, for they ate scarcely anything. Gregor was always hearing one of the family vainly urging another to eat and getting no answer, but, "Thanks, I've had all I want," or something similar. Perhaps they drank nothing either. Time and again, his sister kept asking his father if he wouldn't like some beer, and offered kindly to go and fetch it herself, and when he made no answer, suggested that she could ask the concierge to fetch it, so that he need feel no sense of obligation. But then a round no came from his father, and no more was said about it. In the course of that very first day, Gregor's father explained the family's financial position and prospects to both his mother and his sister. Now and then he rose from the table to get some voucher or memorandum out of the small safe he had rescued from the collapse of his business 5 years earlier. One could hear him opening the complicated lock and rustling papers out and shutting it again. This statement made by his father was the first cheerful information Gregor had heard since his imprisonment. He had been of the opinion that nothing at all was left over from his father's business. At least his father had never said anything to the contrary, and of course he had not asked him directly. At that time, Gregor's sole desire was to do his utmost to help the family to forget as soon as possible the catastrophe that had overwhelmed the business and thrown them all into a state of complete despair. And so he had set to work with unusual ardor, and almost overnight had become a commercial traveler instead of a little clerk, with, of course, much greater chances of earning money, and his success was immediately translated into good round coin, which he could lay on the table for his amazed and happy family. These had been fine times, and they had never recurred, at least not with the same sense of glory, although later on Gregor had earned so much money that he was able to meet the expenses of the whole household, and did so. They had simply got used to it, both the family and Gregor. The money was gratefully accepted and gladly given, but there was no special uprush of warm feeling. With the sister alone had he remained intimate, and it was a secret plan of his that she, who loved music unlike himself, and could play movingly on the violin, should be sent next year to study at the conservatorium, despite the great expense that would entail, which must be made up in some other way. During his brief visits home, the conservatorium was often mentioned in the talks he had with his sister, but always merely as a beautiful dream which could never come true, and his parents discouraged even these innocent references to it. Yet Gregor had made up his mind firmly about it and meant to announce the fact with due solemnity on Christmas Day. Such were the thoughts, completely futile in his present condition, that went through his head as he stood clinging upright to the door and listening. Sometimes, out of sheer weariness, he had to give up listening, and let his head fall negligently against the door. But he always had to pull himself together again at once, for even the slight sound his head made was audible next door, and brought all conversation to a stop. "What can he be doing now?" his father would say after a while, obviously turning toward the door, and only then would the interrupted conversation gradually be set going again. Gregor was now informed as amply as he could wish, for his father tended to repeat himself in his explanations, partly because it was a long time since he had handled such matters, and partly because his mother could not always grasp things at once, that a certain amount of investments, a very small amount, it was true, had survived the wreck of their fortunes, and had even increased a little because the dividends had not been touched meanwhile. And besides that, the money Gregor brought home every month, he had kept only a few dollars for himself, had never been quite used up, and now amounted to a small capital sum. Behind the door, Gregor nodded his head eagerly, rejoiced at this evidence of unexpected thrift and foresight. True, he could really have paid off some more of his father's debts to the chief with his extra money, and so brought much nearer the day on which he could quit his job, but doubtless it was better the way his father had arranged it. Yet this capital was by no means sufficient to let the family live on the interest of it. For 1 year, perhaps, or at the more 2, they could live on the principal, that was all. It was simply a sum that ought not to be touched and should be kept for a rainy day. Money for living expenses would have to be earned. Now his father was still hale enough but an old man, and he had done no work for the past 5 years, and could not be expected to do much during these 5 years. The first years of leisure in his laborious though unsuccessful life, he had grown rather fat and become sluggish. And Gregor's old mother, how was she to earn a living with her asthma, which troubled her even when she walked through the flat, and kept her lying on a sofa every other day panting for breath beside an open window? And was his sister to earn her bread, she who was still a child of 17 and whose life hitherto had been so pleasant, consisting as it did in dressing herself nicely, sleeping long, helping in the housekeeping, going out to a few modest entertainments, and above all playing the violin? At first, whenever the need for earning money was mentioned, Gregor let go of his hold on the door and threw himself down on the cool leather sofa beside it. He felt so hot with shame and grief. Often, he just lay there the long nights through without sleeping at all, scrabbling for hours on the leather, or he nerved himself to the great effort of pushing an armchair to the window, then crawled up over the windowsill and braced against the chair, leaning against the window panes, obviously in some recollection of the sense of freedom that looking out of a window always used to give him. For in reality, day by day, things that were even a little way off were growing dimmer to his sight. The hospital across the street, which he used to execrate for being all too often before his eyes, was now quite beyond his range of vision. And if he had not known that he lived in Charlotte Street, a quiet street, but still a city street, he might have believed that his window gave on a desert waste where grey sky and grey land blended indistinguishably into each other. His quick-witted sister only needed to observe twice that the armchair stood by the window. After that, whenever she had tidied the room, she always pushed the chair back to the same place at the window and even left the inner casements open. If he could have spoken to her and thanked her for all she had to do for him, he could have borne her ministrations better. As it was, they oppressed him. She certainly tried to make as light as possible of whatever was disagreeable in her task, and as time went on, she succeeded, of course, more and more, but time brought more enlightenment to Gregor too. The very way she came and distressed him. Hardly was she in the room when she rushed to the window without even taking time to shut the door, careful as she was usually to shield the sight of Gregor's room from the others, and as if she were almost suffocating tore the casements open with hasty fingers, standing then in the open draught for a while even in the bitterest cold, and drawing deep breaths. This noisy scurry of hers upset Gregor twice a day. He would crouch trembling under the sofa all the time, knowing quite well that she would certainly have spared him such a disturbance had she found it at all possible to stay in his presence without opening the window. On one occasion about a month after Gregor's metamorphosis, when there was surely no reason for her to be still startled at his appearance, she came a little earlier than usual and found him gazing out of the window, quite motionless, and thus well placed to look like a bogey. Gregor would not have been surprised had she not come in at all, for she could not immediately open the window while he was there, but not only did she retreat, she jumped back as if in alarm and banged the door shut. A stranger might well have thought that he had been lying in wait for her there, meaning to bite her. Of course he hid himself under the sofa at once, but he had to wait until midday before she came again, and she seemed more ill at ease than usual. This made him realize how repulsive the sight of him still was to her, and that it was bound to go on being repulsive, and what an effort it must cost her to not run away. even from the sight of the small portion of his body that stuck out from under the sofa. In order to spare her that, therefore, one day he carried a sheet on his back to the sofa. It cost him 4 hours' labor, and arranged it there in such a way as to hide him completely, so that even if she were to bend down, she could not see him. Had she considered the sheet unnecessary, she would certainly have stripped it off the sofa again, for it was clear enough that this curtaining and confining of himself was not likely to conduce to Gregor's comfort. But she left it where it was, and Gregor even fancied that he caught a thankful glance from her eye when he lifted the sheet carefully a very little with his head to see how she was taking the new arrangement. For the first fortnight, his parents could not bring themselves to the point of entering his room, and he often heard them expressing their appreciation of his sister's activities, whereas formerly they had frequently scolded her for being, as they thought, a somewhat useless daughter. But now both of them often waited outside the door, his father and his mother, while his sister tidied his room, and as soon as she came out, she had to tell them exactly how things were in the room, what Gregor had eaten, how he had conducted himself this time, and whether there was not perhaps some slight improvement in his condition. His mother, moreover, began relatively soon to want to visit him, and his father and sister dissuaded her at first with arguments which Gregor listened to very attentively and altogether approved. Later, however, she had to be held back by main force, and when she cried out, "Do let me into Gregor, he is my unfortunate son. Can't you understand that I must go to him?" Gregor thought that it might be well to have her come in, not every day, of course, but perhaps once a week. She understood things, after all, much better than his sister, who was only a child despite the efforts she was making and had perhaps taken on so difficult a task merely out of childish thoughtlessness. Gregor's desire to see his mother was soon fulfilled. During the daytime, he did not want to show himself at the window, out of consideration for his parents, but he could not crawl very far around the few square yards of floor space he had, nor could he bear lying quietly at rest all during the night, while he was fast losing any interest he had ever taken in food, so that for mere recreation he had formed the habit of crawling crisscross over the walls and ceiling. He especially enjoyed hanging suspended from the ceiling. It was much better than lying on the floor. One could breathe more freely, one's body swung and rocked lightly, and in the almost blissful absorption induced by the suspension, it could happen to his own surprise that he let go and fell plump on the floor. Yet he now had his body much better under control than formerly, and even such a big fall did him no harm. His sister at once remarked the new distraction Gregor had found for himself. He left traces behind him of the sticky stuff on his soles wherever he crawled, and she got the idea in her head of giving him as wide a field as possible to crawl in and of removing the pieces of furniture that hindered him, above all, the chest of drawers and the writing desk. But that was more than she could manage all by herself. She did not dare ask her father to help her, and as for the servant girl, a young creature of 16, who had had the courage to stay on after the cook's departure, she could not be asked to help, for she had begged as a special favor that she might keep the kitchen door locked and open it only on a definite summons, so there was nothing left but to apply to her mother at an hour when her father was out, and the old lady did come with exclamations of joyful eagerness, which, however, died away at the door of Gregor's room. Gregor's sister, of course, went in first to see that everything was in order before letting his mother enter. In great haste, Gregor pulled the sheet lower and rucked it more in folds, so that it really looked as if it had been thrown accidentally over the sofa. And this time he did not peer out from under it. He renounced the pleasure of seeing his mother on this occasion and was only glad that she had come at all. "Come in, he's out of sight," said his sister, obviously leading her mother in by the hand. Gregor could now hear the two women struggling to shift the heavy old chest from its place, and his sister claiming the greater part of the labor for herself, without listening to the admonitions of her mother, who feared she might overstrain herself. It took a long time. After at least a quarter of an hour's tugging, his mother objected that the chest had better be left where it was, for in the first place it was too heavy and could never be got out before his father came home, and standing in the middle of the room like that, it would only hamper Gregor's movements, while in the second place, it was not at all certain that removing the furniture would be doing a service to Gregor. She was inclined to think it the contrary. The sight of the naked walls made her own heart heavy, and why shouldn't Gregor have the same feeling, considering that he had been used to his furniture for so long, and might feel forlorn without it? And doesn't it look, she concluded in a low voice. In fact, she had been almost whispering all the time, as if to avoid letting Gregor, whose exact whereabouts she did not know, hear even the tones of her voice, for she was convinced that he could not understand her words. Doesn't it look as if we were showing him, by taking away his furniture, that we have given up hope of his ever getting better, and are just leaving him coldly to himself? I think it would be best to keep his room exactly as it has always been, so that when he comes back to us, he will find everything unchanged and be able all the more easily to forget what has happened in between. On hearing these words from his mother, Gregor realized that the lack of all direct human speech for the past 2 months, together with the monotony of family life, must have confused his mind. Otherwise, he could not account for the fact that he had quite earnestly looked forward to having his room emptied of furnishing. Did he really want his warm room, so comfortably fitted with old family furniture, to be turned into a naked den, in which he would certainly be able to crawl unhampered in all directions, but at the price of shedding simultaneously all recollection of his human background? He had indeed been so near the brink of forgetfulness that only the voice of his mother, which he had not heard for so long, had drawn him back from it. Nothing should be taken out of his room. Everything must stay as it was. He could not dispense with the good influence of the furniture on his state of mind, and even if the furniture did hamper him in his senseless crawling around and around, that was no drawback but a great advantage. Unfortunately, his sister was of the contrary opinion. She had grown accustomed, and not without reason, to consider herself an expert in Gregor's affairs as against her parents, and so her mother's advice was now enough to make her determined on the removal not only of the chest and the writing desk, which had been her first intention, but of all the furniture, except the indispensable sofa. This determination was not, of course, merely the outcome of childish recalcitrance, and of the self-confidence she had recently developed so unexpectedly, and at such cost. She had in fact perceived that Gregor needed a lot of space to crawl about in, while on the other hand, he never used the furniture at all, so far as could be seen. Another factor might also have been the enthusiastic temperament of an adolescent girl, which seeks to indulge itself on every opportunity, and which now tempted Grete in exaggerate horror. Now tempted Grete to exaggerate the horror of her brother's circumstances in order that she might do all the more for him. In a room where Gregor lorded it all alone over empty walls, no one save herself was likely ever to set foot. And so she was not to be moved from a resolve by her mother, who seemed moreover to be ill at ease in Gregor's room and therefore unsure of herself, was soon reduced to silence, and helped her daughter as best she could to push the chest outside. Now Gregor could do without the chest, if need be, but the writing desk he must retain. As soon as the two women had got the chest out of his room, groaning as they pushed it, Gregor stuck his head out from under the sofa to see how he might intervene as kindly and cautiously as possible. But as bad luck would have it, his mother was the first to return, leaving Grete clasping the chest in the room next door, where she was trying to shift it all by herself, without of course moving it from the spot. His mother, however, was not accustomed to the sight of him. It might sicken her, and so in alarm Gregor backed quickly to the other end of the sofa, yet could not prevent the sheet from swaying a little in front. That was enough to put her on the alert. She paused, stood still for a moment, and then went back to Grete. Okay, I'm going to pause it there, as it is 19 minutes. What I understood of the beginning was, initially I thought it was like shame from the father that is the reason the father would take for granted all the work the son did. But then Gregor goes into detail of how the father had saved certain portions of the money that Gregor was making, and apparently made investments as the dividends only grew more valuable, having been saved and put away. Which is a lesson, I don't know if most understand. I think some get it, that some debts can be not necessarily put off forever, but dealt with slowly, and that you can save money whilst slowly paying off debts, so long as there is, a plan put in place on how to get these debts spent down or lowered. As the goal is to hopefully not be in debt. However, in modern day, our system in the US, our banking system is primarily based on accrued debt. So, I don't know if knowledge of the past can be readily applied. Anyways, thought it was shame and ended up being this unspoken of care, which then is indicative of these unwritten rules of societal expectations of every single gender, the societal expectation that the father maintains the household, and then this relinquishing of that maintenance and therein the control of power to the son. So simultaneously not wanting to take the son's efforts for granted and saving it, while also not wanting to relinquish sense of pride, so not readily acknowledging all the efforts, which then translates to looking like it's being taken for granted. And this pride that the son has therein of providing all the money, which could simultaneously be stepping on the pride of the father, which then furthers the father's silence in the issue. And then both of these ways of existing, putting the mother, who is heavily and solely absolutely reliant on anyone and everyone else, especially for being asthmatic, into a position of, I'd say blissful ignorance, but it could be just forced ignorance on the part of both father and son, as well as herself. If you lack control, not only what is the use of worrying about it, but it could act as a bane to your person to worry about it, where you would overinvest your person and just cause more harm to the situation. And while all of the economic strife is happening, the life that goes uncared for, unplanned for, is the daughter, where she is put into a position societally that she does not carry the weight financially of the family, but still relies financially on the family for any future endeavors. So put off your dreams. And the brother is attempting to not only base his pride on provision for the family, but provision for her dreams as well, because I would argue that this sentiment of supporting his sister was also a further means of acknowledging that she was the only one giving him a sense of familial love, where the ignorance of the mother and the inability to profess pride in the son from the father, due to not wanting to relinquish his own, would promote that the only discussion, especially among peers, would be through his sister. So this heartbreaking happenstance of either coming down sick, being a metaphor for turning into a bug, whether that be becoming sick mentally / psychologically or physically, or coming down with affliction of addiction, could also be a metaphor for that. Would put him into a position of fully relinquishing any pride, and then being forever in horror while wanting to be considerate of others, horrified that they would feel so put off by his existence, both in his lack of provision and the provision needed for whatever he has come down with. And so this further alienating himself from any familial love. because now his role is dissipated. And it thus upsets the entire environment and the role everybody else fulfills. And then the emptying of the room of all the human necessities or the human aesthetics. When you feel extreme anxiety, it's been a recognized pattern among many people that it feels good to rearrange the environment. Some people start hoarding when there is such an extreme shift in their life, and some people go into extreme minimalism where they even get rid of necessities. Some people going so far as to choose homelessness, getting rid of their home. And it's like one extreme or the other extreme. And so this wanting to relinquish everything that he understood of himself prior and the aesthetics of this prior knowledge of himself to find comfort in the recreation of who he's becoming, to be able to provide some semblance of nurture to himself, where his family slightly thus acknowledges, especially his sister, the role of a familial peer, is capable of acknowledging this newfound desire in him to try to self-soothe. Whereas mother is like, but he used to be. And so then he is put further into the position of, oh, I am relinquishing everything that I used to be, everything that I used to take pride in. Is it right to further burden the family by settling into who I am now? I should retain some of it. And then furthering this ideation of needing to be overly considerate of everybody else where they are incapable of being considerate of him. Because this is being newly introduced onto him and everyone else simultaneously. So he's still stuck in this role of being overly considerate, and everybody else feeling put out by their now new need to consider him. And in the mother's ignorance, the only way in which she can consider her son is, well, he used to be, and he might still want to be. And all of this being done whilst the father, now needing to take up his old role of pride, is out of the house, is indicative of he needs to settle with who he used to be and rise again. So he could not be further taxed to consider where his son is now. After relinquishing his pride to his son's pride, now his son redefining himself. All of it would be burdensome onto the father, who is not redefining himself, but refinding himself. And this is all indicative of how to exist with imminent change and drastic change, how to properly communicate and cooperate in a healthy way, especially when the world still moves on, whether you are participating in it or not. Which then is exemplified by his incredible loneliness, and finding the only way to apply himself to the world is to stare at it, and then also, whilst being this lonely and stuck in this room, finding that the vision of everything external, everything outside of this room is being lost, because the longer he goes without society and without importance to society, the more he finds himself not understanding it. So yeah, damn Kafka, ouch. Okay, so at that, may your wants align with your needs, and may you be granted the resources needed to do what is needed. Alrighty, good night, and take care of yourselves. Bye-bye.